Super immunity against COVID, and is COVID really SARS? Welcome to another episode of Ask Dr. David. Again, I wish to point out that I'm serving in an educator role here. These are my own opinions about things. Everybody should be looking at things from an individual basis when they're making decisions for themselves. So a couple of really interesting things came up in the news and that I've been being asked questions about. Obviously, one of the interesting things about COVID is how rapidly things are changing and how quickly and often I'm needing to come up with new answers for things that we never really even thought about in the past, even though we've been in this pandemic for a good solid 2 years now. So let's hit up on them. So one of the questions that we've been asked is, what is super immunity? Okay, now there's another term for this, which is also hybrid immunity, which is when a person has built immunity sequentially from either the natural infection plus a vaccine. So that's what hybrid immunity means. So certainly, as we've talked about many times, that there's multiple paths to immunity. But of course, levels of immunity, how immune somebody is, how likely are they to get any symptoms at all, versus being, the more serious hospitalization and God forbid death. But, there's levels of immunity. So, we talk about what people use the term sometimes sterilizing immunity, meaning that they won't get any symptoms whatsoever or can even catch it. And we know that that's probably not going to be happening as SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus moves into a more endemic and more milder form. But certainly people still have different levels of immunity. So all of the information that we're going to be providing, you will find the studies or the articles listed in the description below the video. So please check it out there if you want to see more information. But in this particular study that was in Science Journal, and I'm going to be looking at my notes here a little bit as well because there's more detailed stuff. But what they're really talking about here is that they found that super immunity, this combination hybrid immunity, by far is providing the best immunity against future COVID compared to people who have only had the virus or people who have only had the vaccine, even if they were people who have been multiple doses of the vaccine. But the interesting thing that they found here is that the level of immunity, so what they were doing is they were checking antibody levels, responses to the virus when exposed in the petri dish, etc. They found that whether a person had first gotten vaccinated and then caught wild COVID, or if they had wild COVID and then they had they got the vaccine afterwards, that seemed to bring almost the exact same amount of immunity going forward after that. So again, when we've talked about having there's two different paths of immunity, if a person is saying, hey, it makes sense for me to have hybrid immunity, then of course there's another interesting question there, because of those two paths to hybrid immunity, if a person catches the virus first, of course, they're going into that real virus. And then, of course, more risks associated with that than if a person had vaccine and then caught the virus, because they then have immunity, even if it's not, certainly wasn't sterilizing immunity, but they then had immunity before they caught the virus, which should lead to less cases of severity. Because to this day, as we've also talked about, the overwhelming majority of people who are ending up hospitalized and with more severe disease are people who have no immunity going in, which of course would mean that if they're not vaccinated or if they didn't have the disease. So that's an interesting point that we really didn't know about before, is the fact that there seems to be equal, but both of those paths to hybrid immunity actually get you to the same place at the end in terms of the more broader sense that multiple hits of, when we talked about Omicron being a booster, in this case, if a person had the vaccine and then caught Omicron, this is clear evidence that Omicron is acting as that person's booster as well. So that's one of the important things about this. Now, there were a couple interesting quotes from the study that I will read to you because I really thought it highlighted so much of what we've been talking about. So the authors of the study said, our results show that SARS-CoV-2 infection before or after vaccines gives a significantly larger boost to the neutralizing antibody response compared to the two vaccines alone. Okay, so I know that that's not a popular comment in America and elsewhere with governments and things like that, but it's clearly saying that they found in the study that it's clear that a person who has the hybrid is better than just having the vaccine. Now, the other thing that says is that our data suggests that additional antigen exposure from natural infection, which means people who catch the virus, substantially boosts, here we are our booster word, the quantity, quality and breadth of humoral immune response, regardless of whether it occurs before or after the vaccine. So when people talk about humoral response, this doesn't mean that it's a funny joke, although we can make a joke out of it right now. But humors are, like an old term in the body, are the fluid of our body, the liquids of our body. So when we're talking about antibody levels and what's floating around in our in our bloodstream, that would be considered our humoral immunity, whereas cellular immunity is obviously more the cells itself at the tissues, whether it's the lung tissues, the heart tissues, the kidney tissues, etc. That's where that action is taking place. Now, of course, as we talked about, we certainly talked about, which path might be a safer path. And I realize that there are people out there who don't believe that vaccination is a safe path. We've gone over that before in other videos before, but obviously, still nonetheless, where does it get us? Next question being posed, is it even proper to call Omicron a SARS virus? Now, of course, it's listed as SARS-CoV-2, which I guess by pure definition it would have to be because it has the word SARS in there. But SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. Okay, which is certainly what we were seeing a lot of during original and alpha, beta, delta, is lots of people were getting this acute respiratory syndrome. Why? Because people were having their lungs filled up with inflammatory fluid, developing pneumonia, having acute breathing problems, lowering their oxygen levels, gasping for air, potentially ending up on oxygen or a ventilator. Clear respiratory syndrome. But now, when we're seeing so much more mild case, is it really severe? Right? So that's a fair question. Now, the reality is that while it is much less severe for most people, and the number of cases of severity is much less relative to them people catch it, there are still people who do get a severe acute respiratory syndrome for it. So the technical term I do think does hold up, even though it's a fair, interesting little debate there. But of course, recognizing that that for the overwhelming majority of people, and people who may be even more at risk of having it before, might not be at that level of risk now, but it still can happen. And I think that is an important take-home point, because so often we hear people talking about mild cases, that this is mild, this is just a cold. And yes, for lots of people it is. But if you look at the number of deaths that we're still getting in our country and seeing around the world, recognizing that Omicron is 99% or more of the cases that are going around, the people who are dying right now are almost certainly dying from Omicron. So we can't say it's not a fatal disease. It is. It's just relative to the numbers, it's much less likely for it to happen. Okay. Now, another interesting question is just like, what symptoms are being seen? So we knew on the original presentation of SARS-CoV-2 that there were some really interesting and unique symptoms. In particular, the high number of people who were losing their sense of smell, they're losing their taste, and of course the breathing problems that we were just describing. But if you look at the data that first came out of South Africa, that again, following this trend that we keep talking about, the South Africa to the United Kingdom to America, the reports of the symptoms on the symptom trackers are significantly different. And so what we're hearing, number one and number two, are headaches, significant headaches that are lasting for a few days, and the fatigue and tiredness, which I know people who are in good immunological shape who are still getting these severe fatigues that are lasting for 2 weeks or longer. Now, thankfully, the people I know who've done that, they have come out of a couple of weeks. But we also know that long COVID has been something that can last longer. And of course, we cannot make any statement whatsoever about long COVID relative to Omicron, because it hasn't been around long enough to be called long. So again, we're going to see how this plays out. Are there people who are having it for 2 weeks types of symptoms, but not 2 months, not 6 months? Again, we won't know until the summer or beyond that as to what the reality is there, but you can't blame anything except for the calendar on that one. Now, other symptoms that people are also commonly reporting is a sore throat, a scratchy throat or voice like when they're talking, and really just other cold symptoms like runny nose, sneezing, coughing, that type of thing. But again, I think most of us would say if we had a choice of picking something that was much more severe in our symptoms and the potential of long hauler and losing sense of smell and taste and all of that, which again, some of those things can still happen with Omicron, but at the same time, not seeing surely those numbers. So thank you for listening to this video. We will be having a second video on more questions that are coming up. They're rolling in so fast that we want to put out more than one video about this. Of course, if you haven't, or if you know somebody who hasn't, please get them to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We just passed 700, so we're growing fast now, which is really cool. Also, all of our social media under the tag of @paging Dr. David MD. But also, we've talked a little bit. We introduced last time about the Patreon page. People want to be patrons. You want to support what we're doing for some deeper dives into things, kind of learning a little bit more about what I'm doing personally to go through these types of things that I would talk more on a specific treatment type of protocol. That's the type of thing that we're going to be sharing a little bit more on Patreon as well. But of course, however you wish to join us, please do. We love sharing this information with you. I love being an educator, and I'm so happy that more and more people want to hear what we have to say. Have a great day.